We're delighted to welcome today the spokesman of the Reform Party, which is rapidly becoming a major force in British politics, Alex Phillips. Welcome, Alex.
Hello.
And today we're just going to explore what the Reform Party is all about, and Alex will hopefully explain that for us, and then ask a few questions. So, Alex, tell us about Reform.
Well, basically, there has always been an entity a bit like Reform, I'd say, for the past 3 decades. Back in the day, I was UKIP's head of media. That was sort of in the 2013, 2014, 2015 era, where UKIP were at their peak and really pushing for a referendum to leave the EU, and the only party united behind that. And arguably, it was the force of UKIP and the force of Nigel Farage that got that referendum over the line. And then essentially the forces had to recalibrate back after we'd been successful in winning the referendum to make sure that it was delivered. And I was then part of the Brexit Party, where I was elected to European Parliament. After we then successfully left the EU and thought that we could leave the political playing field, the Brexit Party was essentially put onto ice, changed again, rebranded into Reform UK. And it's been quietly behind the scenes building and growing and starting to develop robust political machinery. And it seems evident now when you look at the polling of the Conservative Party, when you look at the Labour Party lying in wait, when you look at the slippage over Brexit and lots of other issues facing the voter at the moment, from cost of living to the need for energy reform to the culture wars and this inherent growing distrust with establishment politics, that the entity that is Reform UK is desperately needed. So I came back into the fold just before Christmas, and I'm delighted to say the party is already polling around 10%. And that's with limited output. That, you know, we're nipping at the heels of the Liberal Democrats, who have been around for a very long time and have a very capable electoral machine. So I think there's everything to play for. And I think that in the current climate, where people just don't really know how they want to vote, Reform UK is really the only alternative to the big two.
Does Reform UK see itself on the political spectrum?
It does not. And I think the mistake that's always made when an entity such as Reform pops up is that it must therefore be on the right. It must therefore split the Conservative vote. But tracing back that lineage all the way back to the early 2010s, when you look at UKIP and where they garnered their vote, 1/3 was from the Labour Party, 1/3 was from the Conservatives, and 1/3, crucially, was from disenchanted voters who had never voted before. And again, if you look at the demography of the support base for the Brexit Party, it slices and dices in much the same way. And a huge amount of the votes for the Brexit Party came from what is now called the Red Wall seats, those voters that eventually backed Boris Johnson, having been handed on a plate to the Conservative Party, essentially, who probably couldn't vote Labour again. Traditional Labour voters who just feel so detached from that party, who took a chance and voted the Conservative Party, but are very unlikely to want to choose them in the next election. And so I think that they need their vehicle. And Reform, like I said, doesn't want to pinpoint itself as right-wing or left-wing. Some elements of what we propose in our policy document could be regarded as right-wing, some could be regarded as left-wing. A lot is just about doing things differently. And I think that's the clamour now coming from voters. They've seen what's going on in our political system. They know that it's broken, they know that it doesn't deliver, and they know that they feel they have very little choice beyond the big two parties because of the first past the post voting system we have here. But it's important that people do have a choice and can be excited about something, and actually has a political party that reflects them and doesn't pigeonhole them one side of the political spectrum or the other and force them to sign up to essentially a drop-down menu of policies that people regard as, well, if you're right-wing, you must also believe these things. If you're left-wing, you must also believe these things. It's a lot more complex than that. And I think Reform is trying to make sure that it pitches itself to everybody out there who's essentially being ignored.
Well, let's talk about some policies then, because if Reform is going to be taken seriously, it has to have some serious policies behind it. So tax, law and order, immigration, defence, where does Reform stand on those issues? Because you sound sometimes a little bit like the Conservative Party, and the subsequent question to you would be, Are you in danger of splitting the vote?
First of all, on taxation, the UK has one of the most complex taxation systems in the world. And if you've been paying any attention to politics lately, you also know that we have the highest levels of tax since World War II, and that there isn't really much of an agenda for growthonomics. There hasn't really been any sort of concerted effort to cut those taxes and stimulate growth and put money on the ledgers of British businesses, in the pockets of British families. So Reform wants to massively simplify that taxation system, make it far more competitive. So we attract the brightest and the best work-wise. So we attract businesses to the UK, but we don't want to echo the mistakes made during Trustonomics, where there was this sort of gallivant towards the finish line, which wasn't really taking account of political sensibilities or the climate at the moment. I mean, it's all very well cutting taxes and going for growth, but when you've got no money in the exchequer, and when the rest of the world isn't particularly growing and about to enter recession, then you have a difficulty with managing to make those policies pay off. But we do have a commitment to growthonomics, which no other party is really proposing.
Can we just focus in on that for a second? The government is proposing to increase corporation tax from its current level of 19% to 25%. Does Reform have a policy on that?
We want to cut corporation tax because, you know, what people may not understand is this homogenization of corporation tax across the developed world is something that is largely discussed in the World Economic Forum. It's discussed at EU level. And the last thing that our big competitors across the channel want to see is us suddenly cutting corporation tax, but it's necessary to stimulate business here. And I'll give you a key example. It was announced just recently that AstraZeneca, which is an Anglo-Swedish pharmaceutical company who everyone is very familiar with for the vaccine rollout in the UK, has decided to headquarter their operation in Ireland. Why? Because Ireland has a hugely competitive corporation tax. They're often at loggerheads with Brussels over it, in fact, but famously, Ireland's managed to attract some of the big businesses from America, the .com sector, to set up its European headquarters there because of favourable tax rates. And if we're not going to pursue a similar agenda in the UK, then we're just going to see flight of industry, flight of car manufacturing, flight of the things that the UK actually is very good at, which is the service sector of the economy. And so it's utterly vital we cut corporation tax, but also not just for the big boys who might be mass employers, but critically and crucially for small and medium-sized enterprises out there who have been constantly overlooked, where we're part of the behemoth of Brussels, and who actually should be the ones reaping the rewards of Brexit and really being on the receiving end of some of the big dividends and some of the more post-Brexit industrial strategies, the ambitious ones that we can now put in place.
Is the Reform Party committed to keeping corporation tax at 19% rather than raising it, as the Chancellor wants to 25%?
We're definitely not going to go to 25%. We want to bring it back down to 19% and further again still, because I think that we need to start looking at how we can undercut some of the big competitors on our doorsteps, and as a sovereign nation show that we're able to come out with strategies to attract businesses here and retain them.
Can we just move on to some societal issues for a moment? Freedom of expression, cancel culture, wokery, all of that sort of thing. Where does Reform Party stand on that? And how are you going to defend the principles of freedom of speech?
It's a very interesting question, because the culture wars are becoming a huge part of political debate now in a way that's unprecedented, in a way we have not seen at all societally before. And Reform has the benefit of not being beholden to any sort of embedded political correctness. It's not going to tie itself in knots like the Labour Party, who essentially exorcise and excommunicate any daring soul in their party that happens to say that a woman can't have a penis and madness like that. But it's not just about these big top line debates that we see echoed in the press and echoed on Twitter, but what's happening fundamentally in schools as well, where children are essentially being brainwashed and indoctrinated at an early age, and having it imposed upon them what I can only describe as adult fetish. I think it's now become very much a safeguarding issue in schools when you look at the content of some of the sex ed classes, which again is happening in secret. parents aren't finding out about what's being taught to their kids. The private sector companies who are coming into classrooms and getting access to children, teaching some of this content, are not regulated and don't share their curriculum. So people have no idea what is being imposed upon the youth in this country. You're hearing plenty of stories about children who come home from school and their parents find out that their teacher have been labeling them with a different name and gender the whole time without consultation. There is so much going on. There's also, I mean, it's been recorded for a long time, a very distinctive left-wing bent in our classrooms, that teachers feel completely at liberty to impose their personal political viewpoints on children and tell them that Brexit's wrong. Then you've got the complete overhaul of history, where children are being told that there's white privilege and colonialism is all evil and the British Empire was nothing but bad. So there really has to be a concerted approach to getting hold of what is being taught in classes.
What does Reform Party propose to do legislatively or in other ways about this?
The Reform Party at the moment is in consultation about just that, to figure out what our policy framework is going to be. But I think we've got to start leaning towards a position where there is nothing taught to children in schools without parental consent, that parents get to look at the curriculum when it comes to personal education, sex education, and so forth, and get to have a say on whether they want their children involved in those sorts of lessons. I think there also needs to be some sort of gold standard that is put in place with safeguarding at its centre. It's not right that children are being exposed to adult content and adult themes at such a young age, just because the world around them might be becoming coarsened or pornificated, for want of a better phrase. And I think that there needs to be a close look at what's going on in individual schools and some sort of standard set out that every single school, whether it's in the private sphere or the public sphere, needs to sign up to. There's also a big debate going on as well about what happens on the school estate. There's plenty of examples of classrooms around the UK being forced to have unisex toilets and shared facilities, which, especially for young girls growing up, is deeply worrying and deeply concerning. There's a number of high schools where girls are actually going home at lunchtime to use facilities at home and not returning to the classroom. On the flip side of this, you then have schools in parts of Yorkshire, for example, or Lancashire, where it's essentially religious indoctrination and extremism from minor religions is taking hold. And we've seen a big thing in the news lately about an autistic pupil who brought a Quran to school, which got scuffed up in the playground. And next thing, it's being called a hate crime. The police are involved. There are death threats. And all we seem to see is the head teacher acquiescing to the more radical voices from the Islamic community, than looking at, well, this is a UK school and what is proportionate and what protects both the school's relationship with the community and the diverse community, but also what puts the pupil front and centre here. There's famously also the news story about the teacher in Batley who essentially was forced into hiding because he happened to show a cartoon of Muhammad during a PPE lesson. I mean, I think, you know, it's quite clear that schools have become a law unto themselves. They've become, in some parts, far too passive against aggressive forces in communities that are trying to dictate to the schools what's being taught to children, and then far too aggressive when it comes to some of their strategies of exposing children to adult content.
Does Reform have any views about the cancel culture going on? For example, Roald Dahl's novels being rewritten, the treatment of the Harry Potter author even. And also things like museums, what's going on there in terms of presentation of British history. Does Reform have any policies yet on these things? And if so, how would you legislate to stop it?
In terms of policy, all of our policy, like most parties, is still in development. So I don't want to say anything that isn't again going to be completely different in the manifesto next year. But I think it's fair to say that when you've got publicly funded bodies, whether it's museums, art galleries, theatres, then it's only right that the government should play a hand in saying that we do not want to see cancel culture in these spaces. It's very difficult to legislate in the private sector about what they decide to do. And if a private theatre decided it wanted to completely rewrite the works of Shakespeare to make it acceptable in their minds to a modern community, then who is to stop them? And I'd be the last person to say that the arts themselves should be regulated. It comes down to consumer choice. If you want to go to that art gallery, that museum, that theatre, and see that particular curation of that particular exhibition, then fine, it should be a free space. But certainly where things receive lottery funding, taxpayers' money, Arts Council funding, government backing, I think that the government does have a role and a responsibility to make sure that what is our national heritage and what are our cultures, values and social mores are fundamentally protected.